Okay. Tonight we have Dr. Gordon Stanger, and he's going to speak to us on climate-driven migrants. How many? Where will they go? Should there be a Christian response? And briefly about Gordon Stanger. He obtained his geology degree at the University College of London and a PhD in hydrology of the Oman Mountains. And then he's worked for the Institute of Hydrology in the UK, Flinders University. He's been Chief Technical Advisor for the United Nations Development Programme in Yemen, a visiting Fellow of the Australian Academy of Science in Taiwan, and Water Resources and Climate Change Consultant in about 30 other countries. I could go on, but he is quite well qualified to talk to this on this topic, and so we now welcome Gordon to give his presentation on climate-driven migrants. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for attending this presentation. Some of you know me already, and for those who don't, I've been an earth scientist for about half a century, and in particular a climate change impact analyst for about the last 2 decades. And I've worked in most oceans and continents, which I hope and believe gives me a holistic overview of this evening's subject. On the basis of overwhelming evidence, I take it as read that the human-induced climate change is a demonstrable reality. And if anyone wants to challenge me on this, as Kevin says, I'll be happy to lock horns with them during the discussion time. This presentation has 3 sections. First, and I apologize for this, but it's necessary to have a very brief overview of some of the jargon and aspects of the climate science. Otherwise, you won't understand what I'm talking about. Next comes all the somewhat downbeat stuff about long-term human impacts of climate change. And finally, we'll ask, how do we respond? This introductory slide asks, should there be a specifically Christian response? Well, I believe the answer is yes, but one might also ask, should there even be a secular response? Because at the moment, there's nothing. Climate change hasn't gone away while we've been preoccupied with COVID-19. You may not be acquainted with some of the long-term impacts which are on the horizon, but they will affect everyone. Well, maybe not you, but certainly your children and grandchildren and subsequent generations. And we need to start serious planning now. But first, that bit of jargon. Climate change responds to humanity's current and future carbon trajectory. And scientific convention summarizes the many possibilities of that carbon trajectory as one of 4 RCPs, or representative carbon pathways. They vary from RCP 2.6 to RCP 8.5. Just to give a little bit of background to this, you see this value GSC, that's the solar constant, which is what would happen if you had 1 square meter of surface area above the Earth's atmosphere, perpendicular to the line of sight with the sun. You would get, on average, 1,362 watts per square meter. That's the incoming warming from the sun. The RCPs are the extra warming that you would get from carbon dioxide. This vertical scale here is the carbon dioxide equivalent in parts per million. And we can see that we have these 4 RCPs. The red one, RCP 8.5, that's the most pessimistic. Basically, that is what will happen if we go on our merry way, not doing anything about carbon emission reductions. That's the business as usual curve, which is pretty much the worst case. We really hope we don't have to deal with that. The green line, the RCP 2.6, That's what would happen if we had a really strong response to curbing carbon emissions. Personally, and I'll go into this in a bit of detail, I don't think that is any longer possible. What is likely is that over time, we look at the horizontal axis, that's the rest of this century, if you like. Over time, we're hoping that we won't get this. Worst case, we'll get something sort of intermediate, an RCP 4.5 or an RCP 6 or something like that. And I'm going to be talking about the various climate impacts that occur on the assumption that we're looking at a sort of median RCP, median carbon response, if you like. You may be thinking that COVID-19's industrial downturn would have had some sort of effect. If we actually look at this graph, this is known as the Keeling Curve, and it's basically the acid test of where we are going with climate change. This tracks 80 years of average global atmospheric carbon dioxide, and as you can see, the carbon dioxide has been getting more and more. And it's a wiggly line because there's an annual cycle of carbon dioxide due to photosynthesis in Northern Hemisphere forests, basically. But as you can see, the gradient of the curve is, if anything, actually increasing, not decreasing. If we were to limit greenhouse gas emissions to RCP 2.6, this graph by now should have at very least be flattening off and starting to reverse its gradient very soon. And it's not happening, which is why I'm a little bit pessimistic about the 2.6. This is a detail of the most recent part of the carbon emissions. This is carbon dioxide in parts per million in the atmosphere, and as you can see, it's gradually going up. We don't have much of this year's detail yet, but this is the forecast based on May 2020 data from this year. So I've added what we think is going to be the carbon trajectory for this year. It hasn't changed very much. So, bearing in mind that the carbon dioxide keeps going up, can we limit global warming to within the Paris targets? And just to remind you, the idea is that the world should limit the increased temperature relative to pre-industrial circumstances. We should limit that temperature rise to 1.5 degrees and certainly not more than 2 degrees. Well, let's have a look at where we are already. Already in 2020, the average change in temperature compared to pre-industrial times is 1.1 degrees centigrade. Now, in addition to that, before we get to 2100, irrespective of what we do in terms of carbon emissions, there are things called feedback processes. My estimate is that there are about 20 feedback processes. I've got a list of them here. I'm not going to go into them in detail. We can discuss it in the question time afterwards. To be sure, not all of them are positive feedbacks. Of these 20, 2 are negative feedbacks, and 1 we're not sure whether it's going to be positive or negative. But there are various reinforcing processes, if you like, which are likely to increase the temperature. By how much? Well, these are very difficult to pin down. It could be between well, it probably will be between 0.15 and 0.25 degrees centigrade. I'm saying for the sake of argument, it's going to be 0.2 degrees centigrade increase purely due to feedback processes. So if we start at 1.1, That's what we're up to so far. We add in 0.2, which is locked in. That only gives us another 0.2 degrees centigrade for room for maneuver before the end of this century. And bearing in mind the Keeling Curve, which keeps going up, can our future carbon trajectory be RCP 2.6? No, it can't. Can we limit further warming to the equivalent of less than 0.2 degrees? It's looking very, very doubtful. In fact, even limiting the change in temperature to a total of 3 degrees is now looking decidedly doubtful. And were the Paris targets enough anyway? Again, the answer is no. Even a 1.5 degree increase in temperature will cause disastrous floods in India, South and Southeast Asia and elsewhere. The current Paris ambition is likely to cause an average temperature rise of more than 3 degrees C by the end of the century. If we increase that ambition, we might be able to reduce it a bit to not so much 3, but somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees. Full global implementation of the Paris Agreement is likely to reduce the end of century temperature rise to between 0.6 and 1.1 degrees, over and above what we've experienced so far. So the conclusion is that we are heading for something like 3.2 extra degrees this century, warmer than the historic baseline. So let's look at some of the most important consequences of this, and this is really the crux of what I want to present this evening. There's a number of these. We'll start with the sub-Himalayan heat stress. This is a map of northwest India. Okay, Pakistan's here. This is the Indus Valley. That's Afghanistan, Iran. These little white patches along here, these are glaciers up in the Himalayas. And this dark green here is heavily forested area in the Himalayan foothills. The breadbasket of India, and Pakistan for that matter, is this area here, the Punjab. It's quite heavily populated. All these little pale spots that you see, they are cities, some of them quite big cities, bigger than Adelaide, some of them. And this whole region is very much farming country. By and large, the people who live here are poor farmers across the region. They don't have air conditioning. The heat wave mortality in these areas is already high. More than 2,500 died in 2015 just from heat stress. And the region is warming fast. So in addition to the heat effect on humans, we also have to consider the farming consequences. There's a clear negative response of wheat, maize, barley, and so on, yields to increased temperature. The region is on the verge of becoming uninhabitable for farmers. That red spot there is the Thar Desert. Okay, that's the most extreme in recent years, but the temperature there was 51 degrees a few years ago. We need to think about what the impact is on humans. There are 3 variables: temperature, relative humidity, and there's a third one I haven't actually put on this graph, but if you like, a third dimension, which is night recovery. For people working out in the fields, farmers, temperatures of 37, you know, the core body temperature of 37, that's normal. They can get up to 38 for a few hours, but you risk heat exhaustion, you risk impaired physical and mental capacities. And at 39 degrees C, you know, when you've got these humidity factors as well, go straight to hospital immediately. 42 degrees and more, even for a few hours, means heat stroke and death for core temperatures. It's not just the areas around the Himalayas. I mentioned that just because I happen to have worked there and know it quite well. But heat stress is going to occur in a lot of places. Average relative humidity versus average daily temperatures. We plot this and we get this kind of curve. The blue line is serious danger. The red line is very serious danger from heat stress. And where are these going to occur? The top graph is historically where we've had these high temperatures. And historically, if we look at the color code, high temperatures for up to, well, 50 to 100 days in most of these places. The RCP 2.6 I've already discounted, and we can talk about that some more in question time if you like. The 8.5 I'm hoping is going to be way too pessimistic, but even if we look at the RCP 4.5, the areas where you're going to get 200 to 300 days of temperatures above the deadly threshold, look at them, there's right across the tropics, most of West Africa, all of the Indian subcontinent, a bit of Arabia, all of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and sorry Darwin, but even the top end is going to be quite seriously affected. The point is that we're rich in Australia. We can sort of buy our way out of things. We can live in air-conditioned luxury, if you were. Not so for much of the rest of the world. If you look at some of the recent heat waves, these are the sort of things that we've been seeing in newspapers around the world just recently. And this is long before we get to the sort of high temperatures that we've been considering. So the heat response is one thing. Now we come to the Himalayan Piedmont flooding. This arc that I put on it here, which more or less starts in Pakistan and goes right through to Myanmar in the corner here, that's 2.5 to 3,000 kilometer mountain front. In 2013, a huge flood in northwest India killed 6,000 people and affected millions. The region is suffering from poorly planned dams, deforestation, changing monsoon patterns, sand mining, refusal to share hydrologic data, low hydraulic gradients, and a range of other things I won't go into. Okay, some of those are human problems that can be dealt with. Some are distinctly climate change. And what we find is that as the monsoon probably strengthens with climate change, this area, the pale green area that I've outlined here, that's going to become more and more prone to flooding. You've got rapid runoff from steep gradients in the mountains. It hits the flat ground in the Piedmont area, and this is the sort of thing that happens. If this was your home, would you stay knowing that the floods were bad and going to get worse, inevitably going to get worse? A lot of these people are just going to say, it's not worth it. We can't stay here. We can't live here. Where will they go? Well, there are several possibilities, some will be relocation within India. Another possibility, which is going to cause international problems, is if we look at a cross-section of the Himalayas. Okay, that's the south, that's the north. The moist air from the monsoon is coming in this way, and historically all the monsoon dumped its rain in the pre-Himalayas. What's changed is that climate change projected monsoon is going to lift that zone of high rainfall so that the new habitable zone, it becomes the mid-Himalayas. So a lot of people who were living down here are going to move up here. Problem there is lots of people moving into a forested area. What they're going to do, they're going to cut down the trees, which is going to increase runoff, which is going to make flooding back down here even worse. It's a difficult cycle. Well, India has some other problems as well. One of them is groundwater. We have something like 200 to 300 million people living in this part of India. They're farmers. They're mostly fairly poor, but they can afford to have a borehole, and they keep going because they can pump groundwater out. Now, most of those farmers have no idea that the aquifers are finite. Every few years, they run out of water. What do? They just deepen the well and they start pumping again. No problem. Well, it is a problem because the deeper they go, the more it costs to pump the water up for the surface. But the other thing is, there is a base to the aquifer. And sooner or later, those farmers, upon whom 200 or 300 million people depend, will have no groundwater left. You can see it even from space. This picture here, it was taken by the GRACE, well, developed from data from the GRACE satellite. The GRACE satellite circles the Earth and builds up a gradual picture of changes in gravity. When you pump groundwater out of the ground, you're effectively decreasing the density of the ground. So it shows up as a gravity decrease, and you can spot this. It's a big red splodge here. It's not just a local effect, it's a regional effect. So what will they do then? Good question. Another factor, sea level rise. It's real and it's accelerating. As Hugh Ross mentioned in a recent Reasonable Faith meeting, beaches and coastlines have been stable for about 6,000 to 7,000 years. This is now changing. 9% of America's coastline, for example, is now concrete. 60% of China's coastline is now concrete. They're trying to stabilize sea level rise and the associated effects. Already in the Seychelles, once famed sandy beaches are nearly all replaced by a sea wall. In Australia, the projected loss of natural sandy beach is expected to be about 40%, equivalent to about 100 meters of beach loss by the end of the century. And coastal erosion in northern Australia will result in even higher beach loss. Rising sea level in Ganges, Meghna, Brahmaputra Delta. This is a map of Bangladesh, basically. Myanmar's over here, India's over here. Again, these are the glaciers up in the Himalayas. The Ganges is an enormous river, comes down here, drains the Himalayas. The Brahmaputra, if you've ever flown over that part of the world, that is an absolutely gigantic river. And there's another one along here. You might not even notice it. It's called the Meghna. This dark green area here are the Meghalaya Hills, which is notable for having the highest precipitation on the planet. It's measured in meters. And during the monsoon, the runoff from here is phenomenal. So during a flood season, and almost every year now is a flood season, about 30 to 40% of Bangladesh is underwater. It's a perfect storm of problems: Himalayan sedimentation, coastal erosion, tropical storm intensification, monsoon flooding, changeable precipitable moisture, tectonic subsidence, hydrocompaction. There's a whole, I've got a list. I'm not even going to give you the whole list, but the number of problems arising in here is just enormous. And what will they do in Bangladesh when erosion of this area in particular happens? They've got nowhere else to go. They can't go to India because India's built a wall around it. It's it isn't just Trump who can build a wall. This one's 3,200 kilometers long, and much of it is electrified. India recognizes that much of Bangladesh is uninhabitable, and they don't want Bangladeshis coming into India. Other places where sea level rise is going to be a problem. The Mekong Delta has about 18.6 million people in it, equivalent to about 3/4 the population of Australia, and they're in serious trouble. In the last decade, 1 million people have already left the Delta. It's a bit complicated. Actually, 1.7 million left and 0.7 arrived. But the reason most of them are leaving is because of flooding. And about 5% of the population have already left because of climate change effects. It isn't just the Mekong. Globally, about 1 billion people live in major river deltas. The Chinese coast belt, that's possibly the biggest problem regarding climate sea level rise. I should explain this. Mean higher high water level, or this is the worst case of sea level rise. Just to explain what happens here. When you pump water from these heavily populated areas, you pump groundwater and you get subsidence. It's called hydrocompaction. On top of that, you get king tides. On top of that, you get rising sea level. This is all areas where typhoons occur quite regularly. So you get, on top of that, you get storm surge and land-based flooding. Something like 24 million to 69 million people are living below this MHHWL. They're just going to have to move, or at least most of them. Current estimates of the numbers affected are 48 million by the end of the century, or 57 million in the case of Antarctic instability, assuming an RCP of 4.5. Well, we've had a report just in the last 2 or 3 days that Antarctic instability is happening. The glaciers are moving faster, they're accelerating, they're melting really fast. So we can expect the upper level to occur. So we're looking at something like 57 million people in China will have to move before the end of the century. How much will sea level rise by 2100? That's a bit of a controversial thing, subject. The International Panel on Climate Change in 2014 estimated that if this is the global sea level along here, okay, 0 here, that's the historic baseline. They estimated that by the end of the century, those are the error bounds that we'll be looking at. But we now know that those are actually out of date and that the true error bounds are somewhat higher. So we're looking at something like 1 meter rise in sea level by the end of the century. Assuming other feedback processes don't amplify the problem. A very dodgy assumption there. So what will ultimately be the effect? Well, this is an artistic impression of mean higher high level, high water level conditions in Miami Beach. When will it happen? 2060, maybe 2080, 2100, possibly even next century. We don't know. It's difficult to put a date on it, but it will happen. It's just a matter of time. It's just a matter of when it will happen. It's quite curious, actually, that the former governor of Miami actually made it illegal for government employees to actually say or write about climate change or sea level rise. So there's a certain amount of denialism going on there. So there's another aspect, Oceanic Islands. When people think about migrants caused by climate change, almost immediately people think of Oceanic Islands, atolls. Well, there are 2 types of Oceanic Islands, atolls and volcanic seamounts, which are actually different stages of island evolution. Atolls, such as this one in the Maldives, are typically no more than 2 meters above mean sea level. As sea level rises, they will be the first and the most obvious climate change problems. They'll be the first climate change refugees with literally nowhere else to go. Most oceanic islanders live on mountainous islands, mostly volcanic, such as Hawaii, Fiji, Solomon, Samoa, and so on. All they have to do is retreat uphill from the coast. But this causes massive problems of tribal ownership and land tenure. People in Fiji and the Solomon Islands have already been killed for trying to move inland. As I said, people automatically associate climate change with oceanic islanders, but the number displaced from atolls will be tiny, a mere 200,000 at most. This is actually in the Maldives. This is a project I actually had a hand in at one stage. This is the capital of the Maldives, 200 populated islands, which the capital, the highest point is 1.6 meters above mean sea level. Now it's in the middle of the ocean where sea level doesn't vary all that much, but you do get tidal surges there. This island is the same as this island just here. What they've done is put in some sheet steel piling along here. They've dredged sediment from local atolls like these. They've filled this up and they've created an artificial island which is 4 to 6 meters above sea level. And when Mali becomes overwhelmed, they're all going to move into this new island, which is okay if you've got a massive tourist industry and plenty of dollars. It's an expensive option. Okay, other aspects, Andean Glaciers, for example. Back on land, there's Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, Chile. They all get their water supplies from tropical or subtropical Andean glaciers. Now, mountain glacial valleys are amongst the fastest warming environments on the planet. The projected precipitation deficit is typically more than 400 millimeters per year. So what once was equilibrium water supply is already lost equilibrium. Towns and cities are living on unsustainable glacier melt. Then what? Then where do they go? This is nearly all desert around here. Next one, East Africa. If anyone's ever flown over this area, you can look down on Somalia. It's basically a lost cause. Some have argued that higher atmospheric carbon dioxide means more vigorous growth and hence better crops. And that will occur in quite a lot of areas around here. But scientists refer to the East African paradox. The paradox is that you get more rain, but you get less available water, which seems counterintuitive. What happens is, yes, the temperatures are higher, you get more evaporation, the crop water demand is greater, the soil moisture becomes less, the runoff into rivers becomes less. So although on the face of it you've got more water, more of it's used up. So it's quite a difficult situation. All of this area is really very complicated in terms of climate change. There are many things going on. The Intertropical Convergence Zone is a zone of rainfall that migrates from the north to the south and back again every year. And as it does so, particularly over mountainous areas, it dumps quite a lot of rain. But there are dry areas, rain shadow areas. So winners and losers. Where you've got more vigorous crop growth, it doesn't necessarily do you much good because it also means less nutritious crops, a transition from water limiting growth to nutrient limiting growth, higher susceptibility to crop disease. And all this at a time when the availability of the water resource is mostly decreasing, although some exceptions. Looking at the likely changes in crop yields across East Africa. This is a composite from maize, corn, peanuts, the sort of typical crops they grow in East Africa. If you happen to be lucky enough in one of these green areas, if you like, where the yields are likely to increase, you're laughing all the way to the bank. But look, the area of not much change decreases with time. And by the time you get towards the end of the century, you're either a have or a have not. The crop yields are going to decrease on balance overall. So it's not looking good. It's not just East Africa, the Nile Delta, the Nile Delta's this area up here, that's being eroded heavily. It's got problems of salination already, and Ethiopia is building the Grand Renaissance Dam here, which means less water down the Nile into Sudan and Egypt. And there's even been talk about Egypt declaring war on Ethiopia because of that. You've got 11 countries here all competing for dwindling water resources, or water resources which are spoken for more than once. You know, there've been double allocation. So we've got a few problems there, on top of a regional crop decline varying from about 5 to 25% estimated. Central Asia. Well, you've all heard of the drying up of the Aral Sea. The Central Asian republics have long had a chronic water shortage, even before climate change. The regional river flows in Central Asia are enormous. There are about 107 cubic kilometers of water per year on average. That's about 3,800 times the annual flow of the River Murray. Again, it's a complex picture. The water resources comprises rainfall, seasonal snowmelt, glacial melt, high-level glacial growth, but the total has been declining steadily, and the rapidly increasing temperatures, much higher than the global average, increase the crop water demand quite substantially. Then there's the increased sediment, an increased requirement for water storage in an earthquake-prone zone, which is problematic, increased evaporation, and now on top of that, Afghanistan here, that wants its proper fair share of the main river coming along here. So that they'll be asking for another 6 cubic kilometers of irrigation, which they're not going to get because all these other countries are already facing a water shortage. Last example, Syria and Iraq. This is another emerging storm of human and climate change problems coming together. Farmers were giving up and migrating to Lebanon, of all places, even before the conflict problems arose. Climate zones in the fertile crescent are drifting northwards. So there's desertification, which is heading this way, if you like. So it was northern Syria, where most of the agriculture occurred, and there's less and less agriculture because more and more water is being intercepted by other countries, mainly Turkey. On top of that, there's a rainfall decrease of 5 to 8% by 2050 and projected 8 to 15% by the end of the century. 60% of Syria's water and 81% of Iraq's water is from neighboring countries, Turkey and Iran. And they're building dams by the dozen, large dams and hundreds of small dams as well, to deal with their own climate problems. Serious droughts used to occur on average about every 55 years. Now, the average occurrence is 7 or 8 years. The 2006 to 11 drought was the most severe set of crop failures since agricultural civilization began several thousand years ago. In a drought year, 75% of Iraqi farmers lose their entire crop. And the prospects for future agriculture in Syria and Iraq are grim. What would you do? Where would you go? Well, let's add it all up. How many climate-driven migrants are there? I could add other examples, but these are, I think, the main ones. For the various reasons I've already given, these are the numbers in millions of migrants, and it totals 290 million. Or that's by the end of the century. Or to put it another way, if the circle is the total projected global population by the end of the century, the proportion who will be on the move because of climate change is about 3%, that red area there. According to UNHCR, United Nations Humanitarian Crisis Relief, in 2020, 1% of humanity worldwide was already displaced. And that comes from conflict, violence, and persecution. That's about 80 million people. On top of that, another 3% of humanity will be displaced by climate change by 2100. They will have no choice but to migrate to somewhere else, in a planet that is already overpopulated, which to my mind is a recipe for violence and disaster. Now, are these numbers that I give, 290 million by the end of the century, is that realistic? You may be thinking, no, that's incredible, surely it must be wrong. So compare these estimates with those of the three main agencies concerned. The international agencies are the World Bank, the International Organization for Migration, and the United Nations Development Programme, all independent. Note that these three estimates are for 2050 and not 2100, my estimates of 2100. Note secondly that these estimates are all out of date. They are not global, but they are for the three worst climate affected regions. And note that they are for the median RCP, somewhere between 4.5 and 6. So taking these factors into account, the numbers are consistent with my estimates. Yet another way to look at the problem is to compare the impact against previous migrations. We can look at Syrian refugees for the last decade or so. We can look at the total refugees under United Nations care as of last year. We can increase that a little bit with the Rohingya refugees relatively recently, compare that to migrants in Europe at the end of World War II, and then compare that to the number of migrants projected for 2100. I'm not going to be dogmatic about this value. Okay, it may be a bit before 2100 or a bit after, but in that ballpark will occur. So, what are the kinds of response? On the left, we have the world's typical response to migrants so far. They are regarded as a threat, they are different, they are not my responsibility, nobody wants them, not in my backyard syndrome. Migrants are an economic burden, and you know, in Australia we're not going to take on any migrants that can't give a good account of themselves. Build a wall, close the borders, stop the boats, generally xenophobic nationalism. Compare that with what we actually need on the right-hand side and what we seldom see, which is together we are all citizens of the world. The migrants are real people, similar to you and me. They're not there because they want to be. Migrants are a resource. We've all contributed to the problem of climate change, so it's our problem too. They are our responsibility. you could say that all you need is love and commitment and good planning. Well, maybe a few other things that we need to be taken into account also. But why should Christians in particular care? Some would argue that our business is saving souls and not getting involved in secular issues. Well, I disagree with that. Historically, Christianity has taken a lead in secular reform. If not Christians, then who? Somebody has to care. Nobody else is caring at the moment. Nobody else is taking a lead, not even the UNDP, which is a bit surprising. The Western attitude towards Christianity is it's irrelevant. I would argue that championing climate-driven migrants could demonstrate our contemporary relevance. It could be an entree to more effective evangelism if we can show that Christians really do care. Fourth, Jesus, our role model, he loved universally and unconditionally, as we should. And Jesus gave us the parable of the Good Samaritan. So I'd like us to just look at the Good Samaritan issue for a minute. You're all familiar with the parable, but notice how Jesus shocked his audience. He talked about a person who was attacked on the road from Jerusalem. 3 people came by. A priest, he passed by on the other side. A Levite, he passed by on the other side. But the Jewish lawyer that Jesus was talking to would have expected that the 3rd person would have been a Jew, because there were 3 categories of people in Israel: priest, Levite, and Israelite. But Jesus shocked the Jewish lawyer because the real neighbor was a Samaritan, an enemy of the Jews. The Samaritan was not who was expected. The Samaritan is us in our climate-driven migrants context. We are the Samaritans, and the climate-driven migrants are our neighbors. We are urged to be kind, to express love and goodness and all these things. There's 2 kinds of kindness. There's passive kindness, limited kindness, local kindness, or there's proactive kindness, global kindness, politically effective kindness. And I believe that's what we should be involved with. What can we do? Well, climate-driven migrants aren't the big problem yet, but they will be. And there are several things we need to do now. Raise global awareness of CDMs as the ultimate climate change problem, far bigger than bushfires. We need to ensure that all governments, local, state, national, and international, take climate-driven migrants into consideration. We need to urge the United Nations to take its head out of the sand and develop international guidelines for dealing with climate-driven migrants. The 4th is probably the most difficult: change global attitudes to forced migrants. They're not terrorists. Well, there may be the odd terrorist, but the vast majority of them are not terrorists. They're not a security threat. They're people like us. 5th, foster grassroots support, planning and action for CDMs everywhere. 6, defuse climate-driven migrant-generated violence before it erupts. 290 million people on the move with nowhere to go is a recipe for violence, and we have an opportunity to defuse that. Australians to take a compassionate lead on this issue. This needs a cultural change of attitudes. So it's not going to be easy. It's going to be a long, hard struggle, but it's possible. Questions and discussions, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, thank you very much, Gordon. And now it's time to open for questions. Just on the chat line, Brian has come up with a comment. How would changes near the equator be counteracted by changes nearer the poles, which would then become more livable and be able to produce more food?
Yeah, there are going to be climate change winners and losers. And if I were younger with lots of money, boy, would I love to buy up property in Greenland. But yeah, it's a complicated picture. When you actually do the sums, the number of people living in the tropics far outweighs the number of people living in higher latitudes. And yeah, there will be some people who win. Most will lose. That's
I think the point there is that if you've got a lot more people currently in the tropics, which are nicer weather compared to nearer the poles where the weather's not so nice, if you make the weather nicer nearer the poles, then that balance will shift the other way. And you were saying that you've got bread baskets where lots of food is produced near the equator. When it gets warmer nearer the poles, then the food could be produced there, so that even out that way as well.
Yeah, Gordon, at this stage, can you stop sharing your screen? We'll go into a gallery view.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
To some extent, you can do that. It's the political problems involved would be enormous. I mean,
How political problems?
How are people like the Canadians and the Russians going to feel about hundreds of millions of people moving towards them? It's a tricky one. Also, it's just the sheer logistics of changing farming styles across the entire planet is going to be enormous.
I imagine, though, that it wouldn't happen overnight. It would be a gradual adaptation.
Yeah, yeah. I think I'd be most concerned about the water resource. One of the features is that even if the water resource on balance doesn't change, the climate change is going to create more and more climate variability. So the interannual variability becomes huge. So although you may have enough water on average over 10 years, there are going to be times of great excess and times of great shortage. So the water impoundment problems are going to be quite massive.
That's going to be the case, though, whether there's global warming or not, so far as the world is concerned, and the population of the Earth, which I think is the biggest problem here.
Exactly.
Oh, I would agree. Yeah, getting up to 10 billion people at a time when the amount of arable land is decreasing, at a time when people are moving inland, you know, it's a retreat from the coast due to rising sea level and so forth, at a time when there's salinization along coastal areas. The disruption is going to be absolutely enormous.
Gordon, Steve White here. Look, I had my science degree was in atmospheric physics, and then went on to become an Air Force navigator. We certainly had practical lessons in meteorology from Bureau of Meteorology guys, very experienced guys actually. And 75 was the last time I had such a course, and he said, we in Australia, white folks that is, haven't lived here long enough to know the history in Australia. So I started looking into that. I haven't had any practical lectures since then. But as what I look, I see the historic record of 1,000 years ago, I won't go much further back than that, we had what was called the medieval warm period. I have flown to Greenland, observed it. I read that when the Vikings arrived there just over 1,000 years ago, they actually had timber for, well, at least some trees there that they made structures out of. You go there today and there is no timber left. It's though it is still recovering from what was then the mini ice age that lasted, you know, 1300, circa 1300 up till, well, I'm going to put the explosion in Tambora, because I think you would agree there is a strong correlation, as other scientists have said, between a series of quite violent volcanic eruptions that lasted from about 1250, just north of here in Lombok, through to Tambora, not far away from there, 1815, which the following year in Europe was the year without a summer. So I think sulfur dioxide, volcanic dust has caused a quiescent period of about 500, 600 years of quite cool temperatures, which we are now recovering from to a degree, and I don't deny that there is the human input as well. But what I can say is that 1,000 years ago, we don't have thermometers then, but we do know that it appears Greenland is not yet warm enough to support trees anymore. Over in New Zealand, North Island, New Zealand, there's a doctor, I think, from Waikato University has found he uses stalactite evaporation to try and work out the temperature through, well, at least 1,000 years. And he said probably 1,000 years ago, due to a more apparently greater evaporation, the temperature in New Zealand 1,000 years ago might have been half a degree warmer than it is today. I mean, these are measurement, actual ground truth measurements that we're looking at, not theory. And then finally, I'll appeal, as a former with Met background, to the professor of meteorology at the MIT, who, as you probably well know, says that, yes, there is climate change, but the human input is only minor. Now, MIT, as you're well aware, is arguably the most well, prestigious, most highly regarded what I'm going to say, university in the world. He himself was on the IPCC at one stage. So he speaks, as I say, obviously acknowledged by his own peers of being the IPCC. His view is that, again, with what I see happening around, the evidence from 1,000 years ago, that in fact human population, yes, it's making a change, but we've been there before to a large extent without industries contributing much. So anyway, that's my shot. I'll say my bit.
That's a bit to unravel, Gordon. How you going to manage that?
Okay, right. First thing to say, the medieval warm period and the mini ice ages that were not global, they were regional. And of course, you're going to get short, medium and long-term fluctuations in climate around the world. I don't deny that for a minute. I would dispute that volcanic events can change the climate for 500 years. Yes, they do produce a lot of sulfur in the atmosphere and a lot of dust, and the effects can be several decades. Decades, not centuries. The IPCC is now, and you know, there's hundreds of scientists come bureaucrats working in the IPCC, and they're now quite unequivocal that the changes we are seeing cannot be related to natural events, and that they are human derived.
Yes.
The fact that someone in MIT
not someone, I'm sorry, professor of meteorology. Now let's call him what he is. He's a professor of meteorology.
The fact that a professor of meteorology.
The professor of meteorology at MIT.
All right, the professor of meteorology at MIT has one view of human impact. Compare that to the number of scientific papers which have been written over the last few decades saying that the effects of climate change that we are now seeing is human driven or not human driven. I could show you a graph if you wanted me to go back into share screen.
Look, and one of my favourite subjects when I did my physics degree was the history of science, and the number of times there was a dogma that continued for some time and then was overturned. The Big Bang, for instance, was disputed, and so on and so forth. So yeah, look, I don't deny, but I also will now go back to my Bible belief. I go to Romans chapter 1, where it says, those that reject God as creator, their foolish minds will be darkened. Now, if you can tell me of those 13,950, and probably there's the same, you know, there's an equal number that of course believe in evolution, etc. But of those who do not, of those who actually believe as God, who is the creator of this world, then yes, I will listen to them. The rest, I'm afraid, due to the Bible, Romans 1, their foolish minds are darkened.
Well, you're making a spurious correlation between darkened minds and scientific motivation.
No, I'm sorry.
Yes.
No, I don't believe so. I mean, we've got to take the biblical worldview that as people who reject God as the creator, they are likely to be misguided. They've made their decision. They don't want to believe in God, and God has given the curse of having their foolish minds darkened.
Yeah, I think this is a complete red herring. I don't see that belief in God has anything to do with the validity or otherwise of scientific findings.
I'm just saying I will listen to papers. We all know that peer-reviewed people get their peer review who are generally in agreement in many cases, so look, I've said my bit. I think 1,000 years ago we did see a climate that was roughly equivalent. I'll just quote that stalactite measurement from New Zealand, about the same temperature as today.
You can look at individual bits, cherry-picked bits of data from around the world and prove anything, but it's the global picture that matters.
Okay, well, as I say, my experience, albeit brief, in meteorology, having flown through intertropic convergence zones, certainly seen all of that, is that I'm sorry, just one final, this is actually one, a guy who claimed to be a climate scientist in a professional journal made the point that much of the measurements of temperatures in any of the villages and cities is as much due to the extra appliances, vehicles, etc. that we have. Even, for instance, I sit now in an air-conditioned house, gets hot, I turned my heat pump on. It's electrical powered, it can be powered by the sun, but it's still generating a lot of hot air that goes out there. We had none of those earlier in the industrial age. We're now generating so much heat from our appliances. We used to go around in 1 horsepower or even 1 manpower vehicles, now travel around in 100 horsepower, be it electric vehicles, be they petrol driven. So his point was that much of the heat generated in and the temperature rises in cities and villages can now be put down to the extra appliances that we're running, not necessarily to the carbon dioxide.
What you're talking about is the urban heat island effect.
Correct, yes, correct.
Now, there are 3 estimates of the global temperature and the global temperature change. There are Hadcrux in Britain, there's NOAA and NASA. They're the 3 main ones. All 3 of those take the urban heat island effect into account and compensate for them when they're doing the assessment of annual mean temperature.
Okay, well, thanks for that. I appreciate that. Look, it was in a professional journal, not a climate one, admittedly, but that was his issue that he made. But I take your point. As long as it is taken into account that we are now generating so much more heat in our urban environments than we did.
Yeah. It can be up to about 5 degrees warmer in a city than in the surrounding countryside.
Right.
And a lot of work has gone into making those corrections.
Yeah. Okay. No, okay. Now, well, certainly in Australia, I know we've had climate change. I went to I was at the Sunshine Coast. I wanted to see some rainforest, went up the rainforest up inland from Caloundra. There was a patch of rainforest you walked through and there was a stand of gum trees in the middle. Underneath, there was a sign. These gum trees should not be growing in a warm, moist climate here. These developed 600 years ago when this part of Queensland was much drier. Of course, that coincides with probably about the middle of the mini ice age. So there in front of me, gum trees which don't grow in rainforests, was right there in front of me that something had happened 600 years ago. I guess they counted the tree rings to work out the age.
I would argue that the mini ice age did not occur in Australia.
Well, something happened. It was dry 600 years ago.
It may be. There's all sorts of things going on. For example, in Arabia, I've seen forests of acacia trees
Yes.
in circumstances where you would think, how can they possibly be here? Because you have a 60-meter taproot down to the water table. How can they survive for long enough to grow that taproot, you know, on just surface water when there is no surface water? So obviously there have been local variations and fluctuations.
Well, as I say, 1,000 years ago, according to this Kiwi scientist who measures his stalactites, it appears to have been, yeah, there or thereabouts, half a degree warmer 1,000 years ago.
And I'm sure you could find even more anomalies. There are anomalies all over the world, but I would make a strong distinction between looking at individual cases, individual anomalies, and getting it all together and seeing the big picture, because they're very different things.
No, fully agree. No, look, I've said my bit. I'll now mute myself.
It does seem to highlight this issue. Like Steve has a fair bit of knowledge that a lot of us don't have, and you have a lot too, and so it becomes very confusing for all the rest of us.
Gordon, I just have a question for you.
Yep.
What would you see God's role in all of this, given your view probably that God is sovereign?
Oh, absolutely, God is sovereign. I think we are often very arrogant in thinking we can know how God works. God's plan is complicated, it's long-term. He does things that we cannot see the logic in. Now, all sorts of things could be going on in God's mind, good and bad, to do with climate change. And I'm sure it's possible for good to come out of it. For example, if we could get all Christians in all Christian countries to start banging the drum and buttonholing politicians and saying, look, you've got to be serious about these people. These are like us, they're ordinary people. They need to be treated as reasonable people with rights. We could make ourselves, you know, a big voice in the world. And something good can come out of that. What else God has in mind to do with this? So many cases in the Bible, what seems like disaster can be turned to good effect. You know, you can read it all through from Genesis onwards. God's plan is kind of...
What responsibility does God have in this sort of situation, climate change?
The climate change comes about from humanity's ignorance and stubbornness. I mean, we could have seen this coming 160 years ago. The science was there that long ago, but we've done nothing. So humanity generally is stubborn and ignorant and refuses to accept reality in a lot of cases. Now God knew what was going to happen. He knows what's going to happen in ways that we just cannot foresee. So I'm not going to try and speculate. I am sure, particularly if we pray about it, I am sure that God can draw good out of this. He can draw good out of any circumstances.
At this stage, there have been a few comments on the chat line, so I think we should actually deal with those. From Eric, it seems like what we should do points apply equally to people displaced for other reasons such as war. One difference being we have much more warning as climate changes. Eric, would you like to speak to that? Was Eric's gone? Is Eric still here?
Yep. Right. Yeah, just what I said there. The points about what we should do sound like the same points as how we should care for and advocate for refugees for other reasons. The difference being that with climate change migration, we've got lots of warning about that, whereas refugees because of war, that happens within a year or two, and we have to react more quickly.
Yeah, there's a big overlap. And in many cases, it's not just one reason why someone decides to upstick and move. In many cases, and we've seen this in Mexico, in Syria, in Iraq, Bangladesh, a whole swag of places, all kinds of problems come together: human problems, political problems, social problems, agricultural problems, and climate problems. It's seldom that you can pin down and say the reason that person left is because of climate change. Climate change is one of many, many factors. And I don't think we really should be differentiating between climate change refugees and other kind of refugees. But one of the problems is that as far as the UN is concerned and other agencies, they recognize refugees from conflict. They do not recognize refugees from climate change.
Okay, we'll move on to Bronwyn's comment. You paint Australia as having negative attitude to migrants. We already are taking in migrants. I know as I teach them, I believe we will increase our percentage as the needs arises. Would you like to add to that, Bronwyn?
Yeah, I think having worked with teaching migrants for the last 15 years, Australia does bring in refugees. We could do more. That's definitely a case. But I do think that at large, particularly Christians, are very concerned about world events. It's, you know, it's a news article away from very aware of what's happening in the world. Even recently, we've had Hong Kong being, you know, the political issues happening there. And Australia's said that we'll accept some refugees, political refugees from there. I do think over the next few decades, we will start to increase our populations of migrants. They'll probably come from these countries. We tend to change them. Years ago, we were getting them from Africa. Now it's more Asia or Afghanistan, sort of that direction. But it probably will be the island nations eventually. But yeah, I do think I think we have, well, there's certainly room for having more. That's certainly the case. But we're doing our fair share, I think. Yeah.
When I talk about Australia, I'm really meaning the Australian government. I'm well aware of many Christians who are very strong advocates for migrants coming to Australia, and I'm one of them. And I know many people are, you know, good Christians who have a really good attitude. But on the other hand, I look at places like, maybe I shouldn't say this, but some of the attitudes one comes across quite commonly in Queensland are pretty much anti-immigrants. And I think there's a lot we can do in changing attitudes, because when we've got a few thousand people applying for Australia, we can deal with that fairly easily. What do we do in decades to come when we got tens of millions of people wanting to come? That's a problem we haven't addressed. And I think we need to, first of all, address what are we going to do in Australia and what are we going to do internationally. There is no international plan for what we're going to do with large numbers of migrants. It hasn't been addressed, and we need to put it on the political agenda and keep it there.
A comment from June Marks. Can we discuss our response rather than debate the cause? Getting off topic, suggests we need to increase our intake of migrants. Thank you for well presented.
Yeah.
Gordon. Now, June, would you like to add to that at all?
Yes, only that I think, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Yep.
Only that I think this has to be bipartisan. We need to think as a nation on this. Nationally, I think, yes, we do take in migrants, but I think we need to have a plan going forward, knowing that there will be an increase in people on the move right across the planet. You know, we've seen this already, and if it is going to increase because of climate change being another factor, apart from political destabilisation, then we need to work out where are we going to put people. And also, someone raised the increase in population in general across the world. We need to somehow curb population increase.
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely, but you put your finger on the pertinent point. There is no plan for dealing with it, and where's that plan going to come from for dealing with huge numbers of migrants? Mm-hmm. I think we need to be active in working on this, and I, for one, am active. I'm a member of what's called Safe Ground, which is a not-for-profit NGO. And God willing, when the COVID business is over, we intend to be very active in every city in Australia and probably around the world as well, publishing books, making films, doing all kinds of publicity to get politicians to think about, look, here's the problem. We need a plan. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to say at the UN? What's going to be our stance towards huge numbers of people moving around the world? There's just no plan, and we need to put that forth. So I'm calling on people to get involved in that kind of thing. Maybe not with my NGO, but we're looking for cooperative NGOs, other people who are concerned about this thing. I'm wearing, you can't see it here, but let me put it up a bit closer. We've got a little pin here. It's a green triangle with an equals sign and a silver lining around the edge. We're going to get as many people, thousands of people wearing these as possible. They're going to be a talking point when people ask, what is that? That's our lead in to say this equals sign means that migrants are equal to us. They're people like us. They need to be considered like us. And we're going to use this as a talking point, and just one of many, many things, many approaches we're going to do to try and put this issue on the political table and get it and keep it there.
It's the most effective thing you could do to join an activist organisation, so there's some cohesion in the response.
Yeah.
Well, so long as we don't just do nothing. I mean, the temptation is to think, oh, it's too big, I can't handle this, I'll just do nothing. Well, I don't agree with that. I think we can do something. We can do quite a lot.
All right, a comment from Eric Love. Water supply issues are probably becoming relevant in many places now, well before the migration. Eric, do you want to speak to that? You're muted.
Yeah, so as you were talking through water supply, I was thinking the issues around water supply seem like they would be coming up quicker than the issues about water level taking out habitable regions. So it seems like the water supply issues are coming up sooner and need to be addressed sooner.
Worldwide, groundwater has been mismanaged. There are very few places in the world where it's been well managed. Worldwide, the demand for surface water, clean surface water, the demand is outstripping supply. And that problem's just going to get worse because of the population growth.
Are there discussions about that the same as we discuss climate change and energy usage and those sorts of things?
I'm not saying that climate change is the sole factor here. Like most things, it's a complex. And the time frame for dwindling water resources and requirement for more effective management of water resources, it starts now. Some of these climate change issues, we probably won't see them taking effect, kicking in for several centuries again. I've talked of several different aspects of climate change. They're not all going to kick in at once. Some of them we're starting to see already. Some of them are for decades in the future. But yes, it's all part of the overall climate change framework.
Well, that's the end of the chat comments, so it's open to anyone who'd like to raise any further questions or comments.
You know, it wasn't so long ago, I think it was about 50 years ago in my young adulthood, I remember that those who were put forward as being experts on all these things were saying that if we didn't take action, we're all going to freeze. Yeah, though you're looking at the same sort of data and projecting using computer models of the day and other means, and saying that if the world is going to freeze unless we take drastic action.
The computer models of 50 years ago were very, very primitive. Computer models we're dealing with now, I mean, the sophistication of those computer models is phenomenal. I mean, it requires a supercomputer working pretty much full time to keep up with these things. You need, just to write the code for one of these atmospheric ocean coupled global climatic models, just the code, it takes hundreds of people many years to write that code.
My understanding of these computer models that have been used, although they may be very sophisticated, they've not matched the history of what has happened, so that a projection made 5 years ago by a certain model hasn't in fact eventuated and diverges quite a lot from what is now the historical data. And this has happened over and over again. I'm actually very skeptical about all this. The only bit of data that I accept from what's been presented in graphs is that of the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere. I understand that increases. It's been cyclical over a year, and year by year it does increase. I was aware of that when I first read it as a young engineer in Engineers Australia Journal, that was observed then from a weather station in Hawaii, measuring that level of CO2, and that's simply gone on. So I do agree that's been increasing year by year, but it's I don't think it's been demonstrated yet that increasing level of CO2 has had a warming effect or a significant warming effect in the Earth's atmosphere.
I must admit I'm a little bit younger than Jeff, and when I was finishing off my high schooling, there were a lot of people who were quite scared that we were heading into an ice age and they were all going to die.
Correct. That's correct. Mm-hmm. And it was based upon the scientific, those put forward as the scientific experts of the day.
Also, when you talk about these computer models that are so complicated, I work in IT, I understand how these sorts of things are done, and the more complicated they are, the greater room there is for error and for things to go exponentially wrong with just a slight variation in input.
Well, let me just address that for a minute. These computer models, they're basically energy equations. They work very well for sorting out what's going to happen for the temperature. For the most part, there's a few...
Well, basic energy equations, that's easy enough, but you're talking about super complicated ones that require hundreds of people to actually develop in the first place, which is a little bit more than just an equation.
Well, no. The guts of the model is an energy equation. Now, there's a whole range of stuff spin off from that, which just goes on and on and on and on. It's very complicated. The estimates of temperature and the temperature rise are actually remarkably good. That's what the core of the model actually models. But as you go to other parameters which are less directly linked to the temperature and the energy equation, like rainfall and humidity and wind run and all that sort of stuff, the further you go from the original energy equation, the bigger the error bounds become. So the models are very good for temperature. They're not bad for rainfall in most cases. When you get to things like relative humidity and all these other things, there's scope for a lot of variation. But if you, there's something like, I can't remember exactly how many models there are. So something like 30 or 40 global climatic models or clusters of models in existence. And when you do the computer model into comparison, yes, of course, there's some variation, but the general trends are very, very consistent. And this is a level of sophistication which we haven't seen in, well, you know, you compare stuff from 40, 50 years ago, it's just not in the same class at all. You know,
yeah, well, what matters is whether a projection of 5 years ago does actually match what's then happened in the 5 years up till now. And my understanding is that of all the models that have been implemented, and I appreciate that over time they are revised, they're improved, they become more sophisticated, but there's been a wild divergence between the actual measurements in the historically up to this present point in time and the projections that were made 5 years ago, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, and so on. And yes, so this was reason to improve those models, that's for sure. But there's been a very wide divergence. The actual history of what's happened doesn't correlate with what these models generally have predicted.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about here are two different things. If you're talking about the specific location and specific changes in temperature or whatever the parameter is, yes, you can get significant difference between what was modeled and what actually happened. But if you're looking at the big picture, stand back and look at the big picture, the overall picture of warming is still remarkably good.
Well, I actually doubt that. I really do.
Well, we agree to differ then, because I think
well, we did,
very good.
What was the factual situation? What was predicted 5 years ago about temperature? Jeff?
I don't have the data on me at the moment, but that's my understanding from what I have read over some years on the subject, that the models, whatever their value, they're just models, and they're based upon certain assumptions, and they're based upon the data that's fed into them too. And what matters is what actually has been measured. And you know, the other thing too is whether the warming that's predicted is actually a bad thing. And yes, sure, in certain places, warming may be deleterious, but in other places, warming will result in increased rainfall. And certainly, I understand too that the world has actually greened over the last decade, observably greened from satellite photography and everything. And this is seen to, as understood, to be an effect of what warming has occurred. So it's not necessarily bad. In a particular location, yes, maybe, but overall, it's probably resulted in a greater amount of vegetation upon the earth. And I don't see that it's necessarily bad.
There's no doubt about it. It has produced greater biomass on the earth.
Yeah. Yep.
But has it produced greater nutrition in the crops? Has it produced crops which are more or less vulnerable to disease vectors? Now, when you take into effect disease and nutrition, that pretty much wipes out all the gains you have in from biomass.
Well, I understand from reading The Skeptical Environmentalist, for example, by Bjorn Lomborg, which I read quite a long time ago when I first really decided I was going to find out about this whole subject, that in actual fact, and he quotes copiously from United Nations records and everything, that there are more people, a greater proportion of people today have a greater calorific intake, a greater better health, longer life, etc., etc. Sure, there are many people in poverty and there are people who are dying in starvation. That has always been the case. But in actual fact, the data shows that proportionately in the world population, more people are better off year by year by year, you know, in terms of what they're able to consume and their level of health, measured in 100 different ways.
But that's not a climate change effect. That's due to basically better investment, better technology, and so on.
Well, this is all sort of begging the question, really. He points out from United Nations data that people's lives year by year are actually improving, you know.
Well, it depends how you look at the statistics. If you take into account the number of migrants already, of whom there are quite a few millions, tens of millions, I think you'd have a hard time actually making that case.
Well, yeah, when you talk about migrants, yeah, there's always been migrants, and I understand migrants coming from war floods and everything.
Not on the scale that we're looking at now.
Yeah, but how many, are there any that you can say are actually due to climate change? Yeah. I think climate change is very questionable.
Yes, in Syria, in Mexico, in East Africa, there are places which were marginally viable in terms of agriculture and which now are not, and the trends are getting worse in those places.
Syria, for
there can be lots of reasons for that. Yeah,
Syria is a failed state, and that would be the reason why there's people migrated from Syria.
Well, yes, a failed state is chicken and egg. Certainly there are all sorts of political aspects as well to this, but the number of farmers who have up sticks and gone to wherever, further north generally, has been increasing and is projected to increase very substantially.
That can easily be explained by over-farming of what you refer to as marginal farming land to start with, very quickly depleting the soil and making it then useless, whether climate change be involved or not.
No, it's basically the rainfall isn't there anymore. The rainfall's been decreasing.
Yeah.
So they can't grow the crops.
Yeah. Jeff, what do you think our attitude should be? Should we just not worry about it as far as from your point of view?
Well, you know, to be frank, I think this is a complete diversion and of where our efforts should be focused. I think we should be concerned about managing the earth. We should be, you know, from day one, when Adam and Eve were put in the Garden of Eden, it's been the human responsibility given by God to look after and care for creation. I definitely believe that. And so I think we should care for our environment. We should care for every part of our environment. But I actually think this whole issue about so-called climate change and its effects is a big diversion, really. I don't think I really doubt whether it's real, and I don't think that's where we should be focused in our efforts as Christians or as human beings.
That's a wildly different view.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you less.
Well, that hadn't got us very far, has it?
Well, that's my honest view. So
yeah.
Okay.
I happen to agree in a sense that all this concentration on global warming, we have totally forgotten about, well, maybe not totally, but effectively forgotten about so many other issues, environmental issues that need to be addressed, like overfishing, like deforestation, like using up all the land so that it's no longer usable as farms. So desertification, I think, is a word there in many parts of the world. And pollution of other various sorts that are causing more damage, pollution of rivers, pollution of seas, pollution of the atmosphere. There's so much else that is going on aside from just carbon dioxide, and we effectively dropped the ball on all of those things.
Well, I wouldn't for a minute say that there aren't other important issues going on. And at the moment, some of these other issues probably are more important than climate change, but I think that's going to change over the next century. And climate change migration, to my way of thinking, is the one big social issue, which is just going to overarch everything else by the end of the century.
I think it's yet to be shown that increasing carbon dioxide is actually bad. So.
And if it is bad, how much influence is there given the number of humans on the planet now compared to how many there were 1,000 years ago? Just the breathing.
Yeah, I think a lot of the problem is the human population, the size of the human population, but exactly what you can do about that too. It's all very fine for us comfortable Westerners to be talking about that, but who's to say what can you actually do about that, you know? And even where things have been done about controlling population, like China's policy, for example, is that a good thing, you know? It's very doubtful. It has other very, very damaging effects on human society, the policies they've implemented.
Yeah, well, when was it? About 40 years ago, I think the Club of Rome came out with a book called, what was it?
Yeah.
I've forgotten the name, but a famous book. It was basically looking at the fact that whatever your cause, without population control, it's a lost cause. And I don't think that's changed.
Yeah, there are a couple of movies out in recent years that address that particular issue from the Marvel studios, where Thanos decided that he was going to slash the population of the universe by 50%.
Wow. Easy to say.
Well, in the movies, he did it. Everyone else thought it was a bad idea.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. But how do you tackle this humanely? It's a very tricky thing, and I think the education is part of it. But when you got in America, all these so many people who don't even approve of family planning. It's a very difficult problem to actually get a handle on.
I think America is far from the worst place for that in the world.
Yes, you may be right.
Well, at this point, what I'll do now is I'll stop the recording and and then kind of have open discussion without it being recorded, so anything could happen. All right. So thank you very much, Gordon, for your presentation, for fielding all these questions. I did warn you, didn't I, that you might get some dissent, and so that's happened too. So thank you very much. Just formally, in the next meeting in a fortnight's time, yes, we've got a speaker called Kevin Rogers talking on form criticism, which is an entirely different topic. Thank you very much for what you presented today, and I will now stop the recording, and it's just open for unrecorded conversation.
So we can really be frank.